evening and welcome everyone. Thank you, all of you, for joining us for Gratz College's Shusterman Distinguished Scholar Lecture. Representative Emanuel Celler, a half-century of progressive Jewish leadership in Congress, featuring Professor Wayne Dawkins of Morgan State University in Baltimore, Maryland. I'm very excited about this evening, so thank you again for joining us. There will be an opportunity to pose questions to Professor Dawkins later in the program. So while you're listening and enjoying the talk, please use the Q&A tool in your toolbar to put any questions in there, and then I will be facilitating a little session of Q&A later on in the hour, and we'll go through as many questions as we possibly can. You can also use the Q&A tool if you have any tech questions for our IT team. So hopefully you do not, but if you need them, please use that Q&A for that as well. Tonight's program will be recorded and we'll share it out to all of the registrants once we've finished editing it and made it ready for the public. So now it's time to get started. I'd like to kick things off by welcoming, please join me in welcoming the president of Gratz College, Dr. Paul Finkelman.
Good evening and welcome. Thank you for joining us this evening for Gratz's Shusterman Distinguished Lecture Series. This series was founded by the late Murray H. Shusterman of blessed memory, a community leader who served for many years on the board of Gratz College. And it was established to bring outstanding scholarly lectures to Gratz College. I would like to thank his son, Robert Shusterman, who is with us here this evening, for also being a great friend of Gratz College and a great personal friend and supporter of Gratz. Bob taught us that his father always wanted to have cookies at every event, and we look forward to a time when, in fact, we can continue to have cookies at Shusterman events. Unfortunately, we don't have any to hand out tonight, so I hope you have some at home. Tonight, it's my great pleasure to introduce Wayne Dawkins, who is a professor of journalism at Morgan State University in Baltimore. He's a graduate of Long Island University and the Columbia School of Journalism. He served as a professor at Hampton University in Virginia and then moved recently to Morgan State in Baltimore. Wayne's new book, Emanuel Celler, Immigration and Civil Rights Champion, was published last October. He is the author of a number of other books, and 2016, the American Journalism Historians Association awarded him as the Educator of the Year in Journalism. He has earned 3 alumni awards from Columbia University, including the Dean's Medal for Public Service. Wayne had a 24-year career at Gannett and Knight Ridder and Tribune newspapers in New York, New Jersey, Indiana, and Virginia, and he was an online editor for the very famous talk show host Tom Joyner. I have to add a personal note here. I worked with Tom Joyner when he appeared on Henry Louis Gates's PBS program, Finding Your Roots. And in doing so, we discovered that 2 of Tom Joyner's ancestors had been wrongly convicted of murder in South Carolina and executed. And I worked with Tom and Skip Gates to get the state of South Carolina to posthumously pardon them and effectively reverse their conviction. So I know Tom well, and to have worked with him must have been quite thrilling and also probably pretty hard. Wayne is a native of Brooklyn, New York. He grew up in Bedford-Stuyvesant, 6 blocks from Emanuel Celler's boyhood home, 8 blocks from the high school that Emanuel Celler went to, Boys High in Brooklyn. Wayne himself is the son of immigrants from both Jamaica and Panama, and he is also a father, a husband, and has 2 grandchildren. I would also like to note that tonight in our audience are Jill Rifkin and Sue Serfus, who are the granddaughters of Emanuel Celler. And I am delighted that they've come to visit us at Gratz today and to hear this presentation and to hear this program. Second, I would like to introduce Rabbi Lance Sussman. Lance is a PhD historian. He is one of the leading historians of the American Jewish experience. And he has taught at Gratz. Lance and I taught together in an earlier part of our career at the State University of New York. He has been for almost 2 decades the senior rabbi at Reform Congregation Knesset Israel, which is just down the street from Gratz in Elkins Park. A few years ago, I organized a conference at something called the Capitol Hill Historical Society. I'm sorry, the U.S. Capitol Historical Society. And it was a program on immigration. And Lance gave a paper and a talk on Emanuel Celler. So it's a delight to have Lance talking to Wayne about Emanuel Celler and connecting the two of them. I just want to add one thing, which I don't know if will be covered, but it should be covered because we need to start by noting Emanuel Celler is the 5th longest serving member of the U.S. House of Representatives. He served for 49 years and 305 days. Why not 50 years? Because while he was in Congress, they changed the date on which the new Congress would be sworn in. So in his last term of office, he lost those last 2 months, those last 60 days. Nevertheless, 49 years and 305 days makes him the 5th longest serving member of the House and the 8th longest serving member of Congress, because there were 3 senators who served a little bit longer. I am pretty sure, without question, that Emanuel Celler is also the longest serving Jewish American politician in the history of the United States. And unless Lance, putting on his hat as Rabbi Sussman, can correct me, probably the longest serving Jewish political leader anywhere in the history of the world. And with that, I am delighted to first turn it over to Wayne, who's going to introduce Emanuel Celler, talk for a few minutes. Then he's going to invite Lance to come on, and the two of them will have a conversation. And I will have the great pleasure of sitting back and enjoying this. And again, I want to thank all of you for coming. And I particularly want to thank Bob Shusterman for being with us tonight. Wayne, it's all yours.
Thank you, President Paul Finkelman, and the Gratz community for your gracious, generous welcome. Thanks to the family, friends, colleagues who have gathered here today. And a posthumous thank you to Murray Shusterman, who 22 years ago endowed this very lecture to which I have been given a platform. I recognize this opportunity as an honor and privilege. After 3 generations of Jim Crow segregation, Emanuel Celler placed civil rights on the table with his 1957 and 1960 bills that set up the landmark 1964 Civil Rights Act, signed into law by President Lyndon B. Johnson. A year later, Celler watched LBJ sign his signature achievement at the base of the Statue of Liberty, the Hart-Celler Immigration Reform Act, ending 40 years of discriminatory national origins policy. Celler had fought for the change since he was a freshman congressman in the 1920s. Celler was born in 1888, the grandson of immigrants who fled Germany for America during the 1848 revolt in Europe. Celler's childhood was upper middle class, amid working class and poverty-stricken neighbors. His dad was prosperous from making whiskey in the basement of their Brooklyn home until the business failed. And by the way, that home was on Sumner Avenue, which is named after the great abolitionist US Senator Charles Sumner. Celler attended Boys High School and was accepted to Columbia University. He commuted to 116th and Broadway, and after graduation, did postgraduate study at Columbia School of Law. Celler married Stella Barr, his high school sweetheart. To help support his family, Celler sold wine from a wagon to immigrant families. And if we would cue the slide of the family, Celler is his wife, Stella, and the two children. When he took office, he was confronted with the anti-immigrant and eugenics mood in Congress. Eugenics was the junk science that uh, dominated our discourse for about 20 years or so. Um, Despite a ferocious defense that included like-minded colleagues, such as Fiorello LaGuardia, the future four-term mayor of New York, President Calvin Coolidge in 1924 signed national origins into law. Celler was witness to the enactment, then repeal of Prohibition, and then the Great Depression and the Franklin Roosevelt New Deal. Also during the 1930s, Celler watched with horror as Nazism threatened Jews in Europe. America at that time was not a refuge. Isolationism was the political mood. Yet Celler did not quit. He worked with Jewish leaders who sounded alarms that a Holocaust was underway. Celler even confronted Nazism in New York, in one case, briefly upsetting FDR. Celler also prepared Americans for the worst. In 1940, he wrote The Draft and You, a book that efficiently mapped recruiting for military service. This was in order to avoid the waste and bureaucracy that cost lives during World War I and the Civil War. Celler pressed FDR and the US State Department to resume diplomatic relations with the Vatican. That was key because the Pope was trying to work with a number of Western nations to get refugees out of Europe and out of the crush of Nazism. But we did not have relations with the Vatican. With President Harry Truman as president, Celler lobbied for creation of a homeland for Jews in Israel. That move was tricky. Britain at that time controlled Palestine, and the United States did not want to anger Middle East Arab neighbors who provided cheap oil. Nevertheless, the State of Israel was created in 1948. On Truman's watch, Celler became chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, then briefly lost the leadership post when President Dwight Eisenhower was elected in 1952. Eisenhower, and I want to say this slowly, mortgaged refugees. I hope there are questions about that. Eisenhower mortgaged refugees who wanted to enter the United States. Celler regained the chairmanship and worked with that Republican president. Clare Boothe Luce and Celler co-authored legislation to recognize the new democratic nation India, which was a former British colony. And when I spoke several weeks at Columbia University, I noted that yes, Clare Boothe Luce was the wife of Time magazine mogul Henry Luce. There was Estes Kefauver, who with Celler co-authored antitrust and anti-monopoly legislation. Kefauver was a close ally, and he even advanced from the House with Celler to the US Senate and even ran for president. Senator Herbert Lehman of New York was Celler's proxy in a battle with Red Scaremonger Senator Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin. There might be room for questions about that. That was very interesting. Despite the Jim Crow status quo of the early to mid 1900s, Emanuel Celler was an unwavering advocate of equality for Black citizens. He pressed for anti-lynching legislation that infuriated white Southern Democrats. Celler successfully lobbied for a pension for Matthew Henson, who with Robert E. Peary successfully reached the North Pole in 1909. And Celler championed Black Women Army Corps members who challenged discriminatory practices during World War II. In 1957, Celler authored civil rights legislation. Though he often worked with Clarence Mitchell of the NAACP, Mitchell believed the legislation was toothless. Yet, the law and a 1960 follow-up actually had bite. As Senate Majority Leader at that time, Lyndon B. Johnson aided passage of Seller's 1957 Civil Rights Bill. Years later, when LBJ was president, Celler was midwife of the landmark 1964 Civil Rights and Voting Rights Act. If we could once again show that slide of the signing in the White House. Okay, and you'll notice Celler is right at LBJ's shoulder. He is the midwife. And Martin Luther King is leaning in behind LBJ. It's almost as if he's smiling impishly and saying, finally, we did it. Work on the breakthrough civil rights law actually began during the John F. Kennedy administration. It was LBJ, however, who finished the work. Celler also began work on immigration reform during the JFK years, and the completed bill was signed into law by LBJ in 1965. William McCullough, an Ohio Republican and the minority leader on the House Judiciary Committee, worked collegially with Celler. I'll emphasize the collegially part, considering how our politics is run in Washington. Of special note, Hart-Celler immigration was the name of the law. Senator Philip Harper of Michigan was the co-sponsor of record. However, junior Senator Edward M. Kennedy of Massachusetts finished the work with Celler. Immigration reform meant that foreigners who wanted to legally become Americans could, no matter where in the world they came. Exclusions on Asia, Africa, Latin America, and yes, Europe were removed. Cold War realities and moral pressure from civil rights leaders forced the changes. Now, I'll just take a very brief detour and note. I think my aunt from Teaneck, New Jersey is on this webinar call, and she was profoundly affected by the previous national origins just months before it was removed. So feel free to ask me about that. It's an amazing story. It's a bizarre story too. As for civil rights, foes tried to kill that 1964 bill, arguing that white women would be disenfranchised in order to liberate Black people. Celler used cunning and wit to outsmart Representative Howard Judge Smith of Virginia, an arch segregationist. The 1964 Civil Rights Act in its final form became more inclusive, also forbidding discrimination against Americans because of sex and religious beliefs. After nearly 50 years of service, Celler was upset in the spring 1972 Democratic primary by Elizabeth Holtzman, and I see that she will be a distinguished speaker in a few weeks. Elizabeth Holtzman, a woman young enough to be the Judiciary Committee chair's granddaughter. Holtzman went on to serve on that committee during Watergate. That was breaking new ground. A woman in that part, at that point, a young woman on the Watergate committee. And in the post-Celler era, she had a reputation as a tenacious Nazi hunter. Celler's attitudes toward women's rights were more progressive than most of his male colleagues, yet too Victorian for female colleagues such as Representative Bella Abzug of New York, an advocate of the Equal Rights Amendment. Edna Kelly was the first woman member of Congress in the New York delegation and was Celler's political neighbor in Brooklyn. Celler appeared gruff and grumpy. The New York Times labeled him the Congressional Bulldog because of his tenacity. However, and his granddaughters can attest to that, he was playful and droll. He doodled caricatures, kept a diary of wry sayings for public speaking, and loved to play piano in his hotel suite at the Mayflower in Washington, D.C. And if you show the slide of him going to the opera, an avid opera fan, he scolded others who protested the demolition of New York's Metropolitan Opera House because Celler deemed the building an architectural monstrosity. Quote, "Why the sudden urge? Is it publicity?" said Celler. "Some of them probably think Puccini is the name of spaghetti and that Richard Wagner was a baseball player," end quote. Celler, co-author of 3 constitutional amendments, including the 25th, and please let's discuss that, the 25th Amendment about presidential succession, and 300 laws, died in January 1981 at age 92. And I'd like to use recite one of Seller's greatest hits as far as his quotes. And he once said, "To be a successful congressman, one must have the friendliness of a child, the enthusiasm of a teenager, the assurance of a college boy, the diplomacy of a wayward husband, the curiosity of a cat, and the good humor of an idiot." And now I'd like to introduce and welcome Rabbi Lance Sussman, PhD.
Good evening, and thank you, Professor Dawkins, for that wonderful introduction to Representative Emanuel Celler. I'm truly delighted to have this opportunity to talk with you. A full-scale biography of Representative Celler has been long overdue. As you have told us tonight and documented more fully in your book, he's one of the great architects of democratic legislation in the 20th century, and in many ways he became invisible to the larger public. And I think your book is going to go a long way in rectifying that situation and giving him the recognition that is due. And if for nothing else, because we're still debating so much of his legislation. For myself, I discovered, so to speak, Representative Celler by reading accounts about the American Jewish community during the Holocaust. And there are many scholars who are extremely critical, not only of FDR, but of the behavior of the American Jewish community itself, with one grand exception among the politicians, and that was Celler, who as a Democrat, had access to the White House and was tenacious and persistent in fighting for rescue. So that's how I came across him. I'm wondering how you came across him. How did you discover Representative Celler? You've written a number of books, mostly around the issue of Black journalism and your native Brooklyn. So what caught your eye? How did you find this man?
Wonderful question. Well, right out of, I graduated Long Island University, Brooklyn in 1977. And I was trying to start my daily newsroom career. In fact, I hope my favorite Long Island University professor is probably on this crawl, Joseph Doranson, who taught history, and history informed my journalism. But what happened was, immediately after, weeks after I graduated, I was introduced to someone named Andrew Cooper. And he had this startup news service called Transurban News Service, 2 rooms in a office building in downtown Brooklyn. And I agreed to volunteer and write articles, and I kind of tagged along with him. I was told by his widow I became the son they never had because they had daughters. So I come to learn in writing the biography of the man in 2012 that Bedford-Stuyvesant, where I grew up, which is a compact quadrangle-shaped neighborhood, was sliced up into parts of 5 congressional districts, all held by white members, 4 men and a woman, and in a district that was 80% Black and Puerto Rican. And one of them was this man named Emanuel Celler. The other people were noteworthy, people like the future governor of New York, Hugh Carey, the person who's is named after the Keogh retirement plans that some of you on this call have, and so forth. But the thing is, after I did the Cooper book, and I was thinking of, okay, what's next? I don't know why I did it, but I found out that he was the person behind immigration reform. And what I find in just doing some online searches was, yes, he was the person behind immigration reform, but there was some very nasty, oh, to say nasty would be kind. It was just grotesquely anti-Semitic and racist attacks on these online sites that said people like Emanuel Celler and Jacob Javits and Chuck Schumer destroyed our culture, with their attitudes. I became really intrigued, and I made the pitch to the publisher of the Cooper book that we should do a biography of this congressman, just based on the immigration part alone. But then I come to find that he was truly, as a lawyer in California said, the godfather of civil rights legislation, because the legislation had to go through his committee. For the people watching, the living embodiment of Emanuel Celler is Representative Gerald Nadler, chairman of the House Judiciary Committee. I looked into his background. He adored Celler. He did not live in Seller's district, but he adored the man and wanted to emulate him, and he got what he wanted. He chairs the House Judiciary Committee, just like Celler. So yes, that's the backstory how I found Celler thanks to Andy Cooper. And by the way, I just want to emphasize,
Yeah.
Andy Cooper, these 2 academic press books I've written, I'm delving into hidden history, people who have not gotten enough recognition. I tend to shock people and say, if it were not for Andy Cooper, you would never have found out about Shirley Chisholm. Shirley Chisholm is amazing, but when I told you that Bedford-Stuyvesant was grotesquely gerrymandered, it was Cooper's lawsuit that got Bedford-Stuyvesant redrawn into a compact district. And that's when Chisholm boldly grabbed the opportunity to become their congresswoman.
Thank you. I can see why you're both a journalist and a historian. Both parts play very significantly in that story. Thank you. Emanuel Celler is elected as a freshman rep from Brooklyn, and he goes to Washington, and he runs into face-to-face this movement to restrict immigration to the United States. You go into that in your book. Could you set the stage for us so that we can understand what that immigration legislation was about? And is it in any way connected to what we're hearing today about replacement theory?
Yes, I would say so. What's happening was, well, we had from the 1890s into the early 1900s, we had immigrants from Europe just pouring into the country from Italy, from Eastern Europe, from Ireland, and they just kept from Germany, and they just kept coming. In a sense, they were energizing our industrial revolution. America is growing up and booming, and they're coming. And then World War I happens, and World War I was basically a fight among European nations. Germany was among the main culprits. There was a backlash there, but you know what? During that time, immigration actually dropped off. from overseas. It dropped off significantly. And what actually happened during that time, that was the beginning of the great Black migration out of the Deep South, because that, with less immigrants coming in, it was sort of like, drop your plows, get out of those cotton fields, stop being oppressed in the Deep South, and come up north. There's jobs in New York, Chicago, etc. So, there was, but there were several things going on. There was the resentment toward Germany and some of these other European countries. There was also that movement that led to prohibition in 1919, because it was seen as, well, it's these immigrants, it's these beery Germans and these Italians with their wine, and the Jews too, and they're ruining the country too. There were also, this was the era of the Sacco and Vanzetti case, and when I wrote the Cooper book, there was an author who wrote about that case and said, these two men were actually framed. They didn't do all the horrible things that they were accused of doing, but it was just this open hostility. Now you mix, this is like a big pot of gumbo, Professor, because you also throw in this eugenics movement, which was based on social Darwinism. It was not based on any real science, but the top proponents of it went to top Ivy League schools, so they had that, that branding that said, well, they go to Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and Columbia, they must know what they're talking about. But it was junk science, and there were these different grades of Europeans. That was a time when race meant color, skin color then, but race also meant ethnicity. So among different Europeans, there were the right Europeans, and there were the wrong Europeans. When I'm being perfectly crass, I said that national origins was, we only wanted certain kinds of white people in America. I mean, as far as if you were a person of color, you kind of like was not even considered. But we want certain kinds of white people, and if they're from Northern Europe, they work. But if they're those people with their odd customs and culture from Eastern Europe and some of these other places, and we don't want them. So that's what that was about. That's kind of my roundabout answer. I hope I answered your question.
Yes. So my read on Celler, if we move up in time a little bit to the late 30s and then into World War II, is that the American Jewish community was not really committed to the concept of rescue of Jews from Europe. The consensus was, of course, to back the war. Win the war was the best way to save people. And Celler seems to be a standout,
Yeah.
constantly bringing up the issue of rescue and agitating for rescue. And that is not only during the war, but then after the war, he wants to help survivors come to the United States. And by my estimation, he's responsible probably for about 600,000 Jewish survivors of the Holocaust coming to the United States. To what extent do you think that shaped? I mean, he had this early experience in Congress with the 21 and 24 legislation, but then as a rescuer, how much do you think that shapes him will end up in the Hart-Celler Act? Is this what's driving him, or how do you understand his motive?
Wow, you are, I'm not trying to curry favor, but you are a great professor, because what you just said, you have a number, 600,000. That's probably the next book that must be written. It's probably not going to be me, but somebody needs to write that book. In fact, weeks after my book came out, someone wrote a book called The Last Million, because when World War II ended, you had 1 million refugees stuck in Germany and Poland.
Mhm.
And that book has at least a dozen strong references to Celler. If someone at some point, if the webmaster can flash that image of, just briefly, of some of the books that have come out recently that mention Celler. I just keep saying he lives in the endnotes of many new books that are out. And I have a surprise. But to answer your question, to get right to the point, to answer your question, the first 10 years Celler was in Congress, okay, he put up that fight as a freshman with LaGuardia and some other Jewish congressmen and Irish congressmen to not do this national origins, but they did not succeed. So for 10 years in Congress, Celler said, I just don't, I'm starting to wonder why I'm even here. I'm not effective. I'm not getting anything done. But by the mid 30s, when we're going through the Depression, but also we're we didn't have television. We had the radio, and we're hearing in the newspapers, and we're hearing that Hitler is just taking down country after country, and things are getting weird there. We have an ocean separating us to protect us, but maybe not so much. This is where Celler finds his issue, and he is getting. You're right. The Jewish community in America was divided, and I'm so grateful to Dr. Todd Stephen Burrows, who by dumb luck found there's a movie with Celler speaking. It's called Who Shall Live and Who Shall Die, because the Jewish community was split. They were concerned that if they pushed too hard for what was right, there could be a great backlash against them here in America. So there were people who made a choice to say, I'm going to have to pass on this. I'm saying that in shorthand, but Celler was unwavering. He said, we have to do something. Even if I have to offend FDR, which he did on a few occasions. Celler said he could never really read FDR to see if he was really serious. And maybe what was closer to the point, maybe he was kind of serious, but probably the anti-Semitism and racism was housed in the State Department. But Celler did not let that stop him. He pushed and he pushed and he pushed. And then he's also looking at the politics. He gets involved in foreign policy. So, okay, World War II, the Allies win, but Britain was seriously degraded. Now we see the unraveling of the British Empire. So Britain controlled Palestine, but now, which, the Arabs controlled it, and they control Palestine, but Celler is saying we have to find a place for Jewish people to have a place to live. We're trying to bring them into America, but we have national origins. And he found clever ways to get some people in, but he just couldn't get large numbers in. And he said, well, they have to land somewhere. And that's where he made that press for a homeland in what was then Palestine, but is now Israel. And in the book, it's an interesting dance with Harry Truman, because it was Truman who made this happen. Now, Truman could be gruff and coarse, and at times people could have labeled him as anti-Semitic, although there's that saying, don't watch what I say, watch what I do. Truman came around to doing the right thing, even when he was being told adamantly by his Joint Chiefs of Staff in the military and people in the State Department that, we're Americans and we like to drive our cars. And do we want to risk losing our oil from the Middle East and Arab countries just because we want to plant a democratic homeland in the middle of the Middle East? But Truman stayed true. I find Truman amazing in that this man who was so underestimated seemed to make all the tough decisions, whether it was a homeland for Israel, whether it was to end the war by dropping atomic bombs on Japan, whether it was to give the first president to give a major speech on civil rights, and he made it happen. So Celler found his issue, and then with that whole term I use, mortgaging, he was able. Now we're in a Cold War. we're in a Cold War with Russia, or for the older folks, remembered it was the Soviet Union because it was Russia and it was all the countries they conquered and made their super nation. We're still trying to get people into the country. So mortgaging meant in the years of Truman and Eisenhower, in order to bring refugees into the country, they borrowed against the quota. And the quotas that were low for these folks, it was like buying a house. You take out a loan and you just have to pay off the loan later. So they borrowed against the quota, whether you were from Poland or Austria or these various countries, and they brought as many people in as possible until we could change the law. Let me stop there because there are many moving parts to that. But Celler, bottom line, Celler found his issue, and he's tenacious. He was the congressional bulldog because he would just hold his ground and battle you until he got his way.
Moving along, because there's so much to the Emanuel Celler story. You noted in your excellent introduction how sort of his penultimate stage in the House as head of the Judiciary Committee in the House and senior member of Congress, in conjunction with LBJ, pushes through just one major piece of legislation after another, year after year, kind of setting the agenda for the political discussion we're still in the United States. And I'm wondering about interconnections. I remember when I first started reading about Celler and his relationship with, you had mentioned Ted Kennedy, were there ties between civil rights legislation and immigration, for example? Was there some necessary correlation between them to get that through Congress, or were they completely separate tracks?
Oh no, they were kind of hand in glove, because what happened with national origins, and again that crass statement, we only wanted certain kinds of white people, we started to have problems, because many problems, because like for instance, you take the Philippines. The Philippines was our colony. The Filipinos helped us during World War II. How could we not include them? So we started to relax the rules for Filipinos who could come to America. You have India. There's a bizarre case in the book that we had a naturalized American who had his citizenship revoked because he was an Asian Indian, and he sued and said, look, I'm an Aryan. I'm of the highest caste in India. I am an Aryan, just like Europeans who are, Anglos who say they're Aryan. And the Supreme Court ruled, on the science, you're technically right, but we're revoking your citizenship anyway, even though you was a World War I veteran who lived out in Oregon. But now we have India, and Celler worked with Claire Booth Luce and others to recognize them as an independent democratic country. And we did that because, are we going to let this huge country fall into the hands of the communists because we don't like those brown-skinned people? Well, they got that through, and now we had to relax the rules, and we started letting people who are Indian, Asian Indian, into the country. As a matter of fact, I remember as a little boy, my barber, when my mom would take us little boys to the barber shop, my barber was a man named Bobby who was from India, and that was in the early 60s. We had other groups we had to deal with. One of the most bizarre, like I said, my parents are from the Caribbean. Technically, well, what happened was we had the so-called open door policy. We had the Monroe Doctrine in effect. So as far as foreign policy, the US could invade any country in the Western Hemisphere if it involved our strategic interests. But it also meant we liked bringing Caribbean and Latino immigrants into the country to work and do things. So if you were from one of those British colonies, let's take Jamaica, where my father was from. You were considered under that kind of that Anglo quota, which in 1962, I like to joke that when Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad became independent, our government woke up and said, "Oh my God, I didn't know you folks were black." So, but yeah, but to get to the point once again, immigration and civil rights was hand in hand because it wasn't it was tied by just plain morality, and also our strategic self-interest was in jeopardy. If we are barring certain people because of their ethnicity or their color, are we just going to turn them over to the communists in Russia and China and have them work with them? No, we have to do something. So yes, and Celler worked with one of Seller's great talent was he worked with people he didn't particularly care for and people who hated his guts, but he was able to use wit and cunning to get things done. And the current Congress could learn a lot from people like him. I know President Biden got in trouble he got in trouble briefly for saying, yes, he worked with some arch segregationists early in his congressional career, but he did get legislation through. And I know that hurts some people's feelings, but in Congress, you're not supposed to get 100% of what you want. You get as much as you can, and that was Seller's great gift.
Professor Dawkins, I see in our Q&A from the audience, there's a number of questions that are beginning to build up. And before I turn the program over to Naomi Hausman, who's going to help us with the Q&A, I want to thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to talk to the Gratz community. And to me personally, Celler really has been one of my heroes. I'm so glad that members of his family are on. Your grandfather really has been an inspiration to me for many years. And I urge people to read your book because it tells what should not be an unknown story about political history, political culture in the United States. So Naomi, if you would like to moderate the Q&A, we have some excellent questions from a number of our members.
Is it okay if I just point out something that happened recently involving Celler?
You're the guest.
That'd be great.
Okay. So last Thursday, and this was one of my readers. I'm going to call her name Cheryl Duvall, who was one of the main readers, edited drafts of my manuscript, made many of my flabby sentences muscular. And she flagged something on Twitter where a investigative journalist was monitoring a certain Fox News host who will go unnamed because he doesn't deserve a shout out. But he said last Thursday that the Immigration Act of 1965 was, in quotes, the greatest attack on our democracy because it changed the composition of the America's voter rolls purely to benefit the Democratic Party. And that was the end quote. So this journalist, and I'll name him. His name is Jude Legum. He noted in his tweet that when the Immigration Act passed in 1965, Republicans in the House supported the measure 118 to 10. In the Senate, Republicans supported the bill 24 to 3. So what is this unnamed Fox News host saying, who goes by the initials TC, okay? So I'll kind of identify him. Okay, now for my take that, from this book I wrote. So item, furthermore, the Americas, as in south of the border, was placed on a quota for the first time in 1965. That's right. The United States government enjoyed open borders because it was economically beneficial. Quote, we like our Mexicans. syndicated columnist and Texan Molly Ivins said sarcastically, Latin Americans came across the border, picked our crops, landscaped ranchers' homes, did other menial work, and when the economy would slow down, we just pushed them back over the border. So the glamorous actress Eva Longoria famously told public intellectual Henry Louis Gates on his PBS show, Finding Your Roots, quote, I'm seventh generation Texan. We didn't cross the border. The border crossed us. Item, President Ronald Reagan, standard bearer of the conservative movement, in the 1980s said immigration was good for America. Immigrants were hopeful. They cherished freedom and liberty. They started businesses and paid taxes. Reagan's California, he was governor there, was home to many Latinx and Asian citizens. That state in the 21st century has the oxymoric label majority minority. Item, speaking of business and innovation, some of the greatest tech giants have immigrant CEOs. Steve Jobs, heard of him? The Apple computer marketing genius is the son of a Syrian Muslim immigrant. Steve Jobs was given up for adoption. What inspired the company name? Young Steve toiled in a California orchard picking apples. So how's that for an origin story? Also, a retired PhD scholar who read my biography and praised me quite generously said he was particularly touched by my reference to a child of Polish immigrants who became the scientist who invented Kevlar, the fabric used in bulletproof vests. And Casey Kasem, for you music fans, the pop music impresario, was a child of Middle Eastern parents who settled in Michigan. And the final item, as NFL fans reveled last week in last week's pro football draft, the #1 pick, quarterback Trevor Lawrence of Clemson University, is going to the Jacksonville Jaguars, an often underperforming team, now with a hotshot quarterback, a new coach, and a bright future. Is America ready to find out that the owner of the Jaguars is a native of Pakistan who came to America for school, stayed, became a citizen, and a billionaire pro football team owner? Just some food for thought. And with that, I welcome your questions.
Thank you, Professor Dawkins. So we have some interesting questions, and along the lines of the sort of anecdotes and stories you've just told, I think the next question will flow nicely along those lines. The question is about your aunt's experience with the National Origins Act. I think you piqued some of our attendees' interest in that story. So if you could say a little bit about that.
Okay. Well, my beloved Aunt Barbara Pauline Chen McFarker is a classic Caribbean person. Our DNA tends to be as spicy as the food. So she is Afro-Chinese, okay? So what happened, my uncle, Lloyd Handel McFarker, came legally into the United States in the early 60s, and he sent for his wife and 2 children, my first cousins. However, he was told that his wife could not come in yet because before the Celler Act, we had a quota of only 100 Chinese could come into the United States each year. And Aunt Pauline's a hybrid. She's Black and Chinese, but they said, well, your Chinese part prevents you from coming in yet. You're going to have to wait a year and then come in. So, this is the kinds of, these are the,
Madness,
the
right?
kinds of insane things we were dealing with. I mean, so yeah, that's what happened. So
That is a great story. Sad, and tragic, but a
Yes.
great story. It perfectly exemplifies the issue. We also had a question. I think you put out a teaser early in your remarks about the mortgage of refugees, and so one of our attendees would really like you to speak to that and help us understand how Eisenhower mortgaged refugees.
Yes, so he would just get, if you were from a certain country, let's say you're from, I'm going to pick Hungary because I learned the term, it was just mind blowing. My dear Professor Dornson blew my mind when I learned that that ugly slur for Jewish Americans actually came from within the ethnic group. I'm not going to repeat it, but there was this term that came up when I was researching the debate over national origins called hunkies, HUNKIES. And I was like, huh? What?
What is that?
What is that? And
Mhm.
I had to drill down, and I found out those were uh, people from Hungary and neighboring countries. So you had these Midwestern, it was one congressman in particular from Kansas. He said, we don't want these hunkies in our country. So I'm picking them because it was 1956 when the Soviet Union invaded Hungary because people were rising up against the communists, and we were trying to get people out of there. But our quota may have said we only allow 3,000 a year tops. So the mortgaging part was, we're going to borrow on that number and let more people in. And you're going to have until, like, they set some target. Let's say, I think they actually said in 1956, you have until 2021 to pay off that bill in human capital. So that's what Celler, he had willing presidents, because first Truman recognized the problem, and then Eisenhower recognized the problem. And then while Eisenhower was president, Senator John F. Kennedy wrote the book that won a Pulitzer Prize, where he criticized, he said, our immigration policy is going to cost us in the Cold War. We have to open up the country. We can't operate like this anymore. So that was mortgaging. We were borrowing only, it wasn't dollar bills, it was human beings.
Gotcha, thank you. So I'm going to ask our IT team to bring out our president so he can show his video. He has a question for you, Professor Dawkins. There we go.
Okay, actually, I just want to add like a footnote to what you just talked about, because under the 1924 Immigration Act, which is what Celler began fighting when he enters Congress in 23, there is no category of refugee.
Right.
We live in a world today where we talk about refugees. So there's no status of a refugee who can come into the country outside the quota because their lives are in danger. So, for example, when the famous ship, the St. Louis, comes to America and they say, let us in, we're refugees, American law says we don't recognize the status of refugee. After the Holocaust, after understanding what had happened, you get the Hungarian Revolution. Hungarians are likely to be killed by Soviets. Eisenhower says, well, we're going to mortgage the quota, which nobody had thought of doing because it's totally creative and probably, outside the law, but Eisenhower had a lot of clout. And that is when, and then finally, after the Cuban Revolution, when there are hundreds of thousands of Cubans who are trying to flee Castro, that's when we developed the notion of refugee. And that gets built into the 65 Act. Now I'll shut up. I used to teach law, so every once in a while I have to pretend I still can.
And I want to emphasize, since I now teach a class on the African diaspora, if you count Cubans like you count Americans, Cuba is actually a nation that is about at least 70% Black.
Mm-hmm.
But they have racial hangups, but it's not like the unique racial hangups we have here in the United States. But that's another thing. Yeah, that's the master class on refugees, because most of the overwhelming refugees that came to South Florida tended to identify more with being white and being Spanish, and most of the people left behind are Afro-Cuban.
Of African, right, right. All right, so I'm looking at the time, Professor Dawkins, and we're going to wrap in a few minutes, but I have one question that I think you'll enjoy answering as a man of Brooklyn. And the question is this: how long has Brooklyn, specifically Bed-Stuy, been a political powerhouse?
Okay. I would say okay. I would say Andy Cooper. Andy Cooper's legacy is that he helped organize Brooklyn politically. He wrote a political column for the Amsterdam News in the 70s, just before I met him, because it used to be the political center, the Black political center of New York City was Harlem,
Mm-hmm.
and even Manhattan, the entire, but mostly Harlem. And I'm glad you asked that. By the 1960s, people are starting to leave Harlem. If you're Black and you have the means, you may be moving to Queens, which was then like a suburb, or northern New Jersey, or up to Westchester. They're starting to empty out, and many of them also coming to Brooklyn. But politicians in Harlem would say, whatever. You may now have the numbers, but we still get our phone calls returned from Washington and Albany. But I'd say by the 70s or so,
Mm-hmm.
Brooklyn now becomes the political, and we call that Central Brooklyn, which is Bedford-Stuyvesant, Crown Heights, which has the large Hasidic Jewish community, Brownsville, which used to be a big chunk of Sellers District. And I would even count Williamsburg, which has the other Hasidic Jewish community. But that's Central Brooklyn, okay? So 70s and 80s, they became politically powerful. Now you had Shirley Chisholm, but soon you had multiple Black members of Congress in Brooklyn. In fact, right now, this last year, one of the drop the mic moments was Hakeem Jeffries, who is one of those congressmen,
Mm-hmm.
when he spoke during the impeachment hearings. He quoted the hip hop star Biggie Smalls, where he said, "And if you don't know, now you know."
Now you know.
So, but some of my colleagues have warned me that the Brooklyn had its era for about 20 years, and maybe the Black political center may have shifted to Queens,
Mm.
which, the Queens of my childhood was, it was a county of New York City, but it was suburban. You had suburban looking houses. I remember we still had dairy farms in Queens.
Mm-hmm.
we used to get
Right.
we actually had a milkman bring bottles of milk to our home. But the center of gravity may have shifted, but Brooklyn is definitely powerful. If you don't believe me, until the 1990s, I had old timers that were still upset that the Dodgers left Brooklyn. We didn't have a major league team. But now we have the Brooklyn Nets downtown, and I believe the NHL Islanders have moved back into Brooklyn and play in that arena. So, I can't even go back to live in my hometown. Brooklyn has gone Hollywood.
Yes.
This working class.
Yeah, they're all moving to Philly now.
Yes.
They're moving to Philly.
Hey, wait, I just want to add that you're forgetting another Brooklyn kid named Chuck Schumer,
Oh, yes.
who is the
Chuck
Senate
Schumer,
Majority Leader.
the
And
Senate Majority Leader, who, by the way, succeeded. He took over Seller's seat when he was in the House, And then he got the upgrade to move up to the Senate. Oh yeah.
And what you've described as a Black movement to Brooklyn, there is a similar movement out of the Lower East Side of New York City of Jews into Brooklyn, also further out, out towards.
Where I went to high school, like
Yeah,
Borough
yeah.
Park,
So
Windsor.
it's become an ethnic powerhouse because of these two movements, and important people like Celler and Schumer,
Yeah.
and
And Biggie Smalls.
and Biggie Small, yeah.
All right, so gentlemen, I want to thank you all, and I would like to thank especially you, Professor Dawkins, for this excellent and thoughtful presentation. I'd like to thank Rabbi Dr. Sussman, of course, Dr. Finkelman, the president of Gratz College, for this entire thoughtful evening, very insightful and has so much resonance for all that's going on today. So history is so important, especially in these days of misinformation and collective forgetting. So I appreciate all that you've done to bring this hidden story to light. I know I did not learn about Representative Sellers in school, so I really do appreciate this, and I think it will have a big impact. So with that, I'd like to just make a note that to all those who are here, to thank you for joining us, for learning with us tonight, and remember that we're hosting many more excellent programs in the coming weeks. As you mentioned, Professor Dawkins, as you mentioned earlier this evening, we are going to be hosting a talk with the Honorable Elizabeth Holtzman, who unseated Representative Celler when she was a young woman. So she'll be coming to Gratz on June 16th, and she'll be speaking about her very groundbreaking work. She was actually the first member of Congress to expose the presence of Nazis in the US and institute measures, including a new law to bring them to justice. So she's going to be talking about her work around the Nazi hunters for over 40 years. So you can register for her talk and all the many other talks coming up at Gratz on our website, gratz.edu. And just wanted to let you know that if you feel so moved to support Gratz, we do rely on our community to support our work. So please consider making a gift if that's meaningful for you. And again, you can do that on our website. You can give me a call. I am the Director of Institutional Advancement at Gratz, and so I'd be happy to speak with you. So feel free to reach out to me anytime at nhausman@gratz.edu. So again, thank you to everyone. Have a good evening. Be safe and be well. Good night.